And we are live. Welcome to another episode of the New York Information Security. I have the great pleasure to introduce Stephen Fridakis, who is the Chief Information Security Officer for the company called Verily, who's part of the Alphabet companies for Google. Thanks very much, Stephen, for joining me.
Thank you for inviting me. Very good.
So you have an absolutely fascinating background. You've done so much. You've been to different roles, and I would love to dissect that a little bit. How did you get started in the information security, IT security space?
Almost by accident. In my early years of life, I was working in London as an accountant while studying, and my responsibility was for a courier company to work on a system to actually bill across different currencies. That was the time where Europe had multiple currencies. So I was approached by someone who was going to build a system and computerize it and was looking for a business analyst, tester, and so on. And that was my first foray into computer applications. So one thing led to the other, and I was intrigued by how things work. I pursued some more formal studies on computer science, and then I got involved for many years with that same company, taking all their applications from essentially what was a mainframe at the time to Unix-based applications to databases and so on. So that's how it all started.
Back then, there were not too many certifications, too many manuals. A lot of this stuff had to be, dug out, right? Is that correct? Because people now have it pretty easy. They just go on YouTube, they Google some, information, and then you get a lot of how-tos and so on. But back then, there wasn't the case, right?
There was a different kind of discipline. Those days, you actually had to find the manual. I don't think a lot of people would remember very structured programming languages of the day. Thankfully, I never did COBOL.
Why thankfully?
I guess I want certain people in the Silicon Valley to keep on talking to me, so I have to say that. So I did do some things called RPG2 and RPG400 and such. But to your point, we had to find the manual. We had to seek peers that actually had experience, and you had to go through a process to figure out how things work. It wasn't particularly easy, but it built a lot of good skills that we could use in the future.
Yeah, and you continued in your career path. You've done. You became senior chief information security officer and so on in some very large organizations. So, how did you progress from being a business analyst with a hands-on on the keyboard to more of a kind of business managerial role in cybersecurity?
So you have to. I can only talk about myself, but I think you have to be inquisitive. So over the years, I was afforded very good opportunities, and to some degree, learn to be able to take risks and count on study or learning from taking risks. So I think that's going to be a lot of what we're talking about today. So while I was working as a business analyst, as a tester, as a QA person, I started actually getting more involved in certain peripheral aspects of the coding work. One of the things that stick out in mind was we were trying, the same company, this courier company, we were trying to send out code that had to fit into a low-density floppy disk. So my job was, how do I take this code that did not fit and essentially strip it so that I can fit it into the distribution that was quite sizable, and using HD floppies, for those who remember what that is, would cost much more money than using the 600K low definition. So that's what got me into that work. So one thing led to the other, and I worked with organizations that were doing banking software, worked on databases, Informix, a lot of work on Informix, and then moved on to others like Oracle and so on. And those doing DBA work, got into scripting, and then I had the opportunity to work with Netscape in the very early days. at that point, we were introduced into the whole notion of integration of an application into someone's business. Those days, our clients did not exactly understand the internet, but they knew they had to have it. Those were early days of auction sites, bill presentment, all kinds of different functions that were done as standalone applications using the internet. It was not something that a company had yet adopted the internet in its entirety for their processing. So we worked on those components, and then we had to actually become much more hands-on technical, both from the integration perspective, understanding what they have, but we also come to realize that the things that we were taking for granted, like authentication, like tracking, monitoring, had to come by applications that we would third-party, in other words, that we would integrate with our platform. So that was the idea, and that's what we had to figure out. And that's what prompted me to get an interest on security, and also prompted me to become much more hands-on and understand that I had to actually understand how it is architected, how it works, how it interacts with other things, and also start being concerned more about fitting the regulatory and operational environment of the client. So that was the big event working for Netscape that led me into becoming more aware and more senior in my approach to projects and work.
And it's just the story is so amazing. I want to kind of like, peel the onion in a little bit on that. So first, back in the day, it's, if I recall correctly, people were questioning this whole internet. How do you even make money off it, right? And then, maybe tell me the story about how you came across Netscape as a company, and what was it like? Because that was a rocket ship, right? When it grew, you were early employee, and then it grew exponentially. And then the second piece of that question is, the internet itself was kind of an open, communication platform, and security wasn't even a thing back then. It was inherently, there was nothing in there, so you had to basically pave your own path for security applications and secure applications, right? So there's kind of two-part questions here.
Indeed. So going back memory lane, I was working for Oracle and I lived in LA. I had a good friend over the years who unfortunately is not with us anymore. He passed playing tennis, which was his passion. So he called me up and he described to me something that I have to admit I did not fully understand, but those were the days that you would actually meet someone outside, another long gone but not forgotten. We were outside Fry's Electronics in San Jose, and he says, we're building this company. There's going to be these connected networks. It's going to look like ARPANET, and we're looking for somebody. And it didn't take much. I trusted, his name was Slava Weinman. So I trusted Slava, and next thing I know, I had an interview and signed up to work for Netscape. But again, to be totally truthful here, I didn't exactly understand how it all worked, and it took some time to do. Netscape at the time was very, I don't want to say primitive, but it was the very early days. So Navigator had not even been sent out yet. A lot of the other applications that we know now, like all the merchant applications that were acquired and then integrated, didn't exist. LDAP did not exist. So it was the very early days. So when we were going to a client and we're saying, we will build you essentially a website, we used to do that in the very beginning, and then we became very expensive. And other companies will work with us to build essentially a channel. We worked on a lot of interesting websites, and some of those websites, I think, sort of now they are sort of self-evident, but those days, it was a big deal when an organization will actually launch a website. At Netscape, I recall some of us, we were given the choice to work on a lot of the men-oriented magazines, which were some of our bigger customers. There were some very nice parties there. So we worked on some of those. But I was mostly working on banking. So the early days, I worked with Bank of America on the very first bill presentment system. So case in point, we worked on Prudential's claim support and claim online management system. And many of us were sat around the table. I remember like it's now, but more than 25 years ago. And we're saying, how do we know that the customer who is actually authenticating is whom they claim to be? And that led us into this SMS-based authentication, which was an idea that came, I can't claim I was the first one by any means, but
Steve, it's true you can. This is the internet. Everybody can say whatever they want.
Yeah, but I would not. And I'm saying these were ideas that were coming by means of hitting a wall. And then little by little, those days more than today, we had to be aware of products that are popping up and become available. Products like how do we take things for granted, like creating a service and placing the service or exposing it to the internet. Those days, that would be very helpful, yet you could not do it from products from within. So the whole notion of internet architecture evolved down the line when we could take for granted a lot of pieces that in the early days were not available. So this whole notion of service orchestration or SDLC, none of that existed. And we brought paradigms from client-server architectures into the internet. And it will take a lot of years before we see something that was truly internet-based and internet-created. So, and I hope I answer your questions.
Yeah, absolutely. I would ask that another question in regards to that. So today, there are a lot of established frameworks for security, right? So if you wanted to start somewhere, you pick a framework of your liking or whoever recommends that to you for your peers, trusted advisor, and so on. Yeah. And then you start to implement that. Back in the day, there wasn't anything like that, right? Everything was so new. So how would somebody go about figuring out where to start? As you mentioned, there was this question of, okay, how do we know that the person is actually who they say they are? So how did you go about doing that in the early days?
So even to some extent, we do the same today for hybrid environments of, say, regulated industries. So we sit back and say, how do you run your business? So what is your policy? What are the controls? So if you go to a regulated business, you go, say, to a financial organization, and they say, we run it based on Sarbanes-Oxley, or we have some SEC controls. And then you have to say, how do I extend those controls to an internet-based application architecture, whatever it is? So the control itself, the spirit of the control remains the same. And what should change is the evidence, the applicability to your new architecture. And that's what we used to do. Even today, there are, obviously, we know Cloud Security Alliance, we know a lot of frameworks that are sort of specific to internet applications. However, when we think of ISO and when we think of other systems that may not be as prescriptive, then you still have to go through the same process to say, how do I stay true to the spirit of the control, but being aware of the architecture that I have here, being able to satisfy what my auditors would expect and what the regulator expects. I don't think that process has changed much. And it depends very much on your framework, because as I said, there are frameworks that are rather explicit, and there are some others that are a little bit broader. And there is some leeway and there is some capability to see how you will actually, to some degree, translate it and apply it to your operations. And I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, so if I double click on that, pun intended, I would ask about specifically, so it looks like things have not really changed that much. We fundamentally, the way we look at security architecture is very similar to the way it was 25 years ago. We may have maybe put a name to it, when these frameworks came about. It's more structured, like, now they call it zero trust, so now they call it, defense in depth. But most of it was already established back in the day. And now they just, have a naming convention to it, or, a method to follow. But the majority of the the pieces were there by necessity. So, right? Is that correct?
So let me give you an example of what I do today. So I work for Verily. Verily is in the health sciences business. We have a number of applications that half of them or so have embedded hardware, sensors, devices. We deal with things like doing endoscopies, colonoscopies, and then taking that image through a camera that we develop, and have a computer application that we built looking at those images. And we believe to a high degree that we can be much more effective in identifying cancer than, say, a doctor during the end of the day who may be tired or who may be complacent. And obviously, we do value doctors a lot, but this is just an aid that seems to have results. So this is what we do. In this context, we're dealing with SOC, we're dealing with HIPAA. Because we have a medical lab, we're dealing with something known as CLIA, CLIA, which is a medical lab standard, similar to HIPAA, but not exactly. We're dealing with ISO because we have devices, and even though we don't manufacture, we work with partners that do that. Now, you have a choice. The choice is to look at each one of these frameworks individually, and that's going to end up being very, very complicated and pricey. So what we do is we look at the controls of each one of the framework, and we look at commonalities, and we establish what is the buzzword for that would be a common controls framework. Common controls frameworks exist. You can actually look at common controls frameworks and say, I'm going to use these controls, and I know that by doing that, I'm going to be HIPAA, I wouldn't say compliant, but HIPAA aware and SOC aware and so on, and hope for the best once the audit comes. So that's what we do. And that is what we've seen. Over the years, there is proliferation of frameworks within a context. So we see GDPR, privacy, Europe. That leads into a lot of different architectures. We have Sarbanes, obviously we know the perspective and the purpose of that. HIPAA for healthcare applications, ISO for these. Are you in the movie business? You have the MPAA framework. You know, every industry has its own. But for the purposes of economy and for the purposes of effectiveness, frankly, of the controls, so that you don't have the same control in 5 different iterations, we analyze them and come up with a common control framework. That is what I have found to be effective. At the end of the day, how the framework is articulated has to be in business terms. And we rely on our business partners or counterparts to be able to develop a capability to satisfy the control. So it would be very difficult for any organization to be able to have a set of standards and a set of attestations for, say, HIPAA, and then a whole different one, frankly, for the same, pretty much, context for ISO or SOC. So we don't do that.
You know, it's so interesting. So you are a quote unquote startup within a larger umbrella of a parent company.
Yes.
And I talked to CISOs in working with kind of similar situation where they were working with a startup to protect itself. There are certain challenges when it comes to a fast moving company, right? A startup that wants to go to market, and maybe it's applicable to you, but for example, there's not as many resources available to you to verify, for example, the code, and it's all about go to market quickly, and also you have to establish the security culture around it, because the founders typically all they want to do is they want to move fast. They want to create the product, sell the product, and go to market is first priority. Do you find that in your particular role is something that you can relate to?
Yes, without obviously talking about the attitude of our founders, but
no, of course, in general terms,
a culture shift as you grow. Sometimes people refer to that as growing pains, but the way these things manifest themselves is that there is very rarely, as you grow, a good alignment between what sales promises, what the product management delivers, and what security wants. So if we imagine all these parties, and quite a few more, because we have a very structured quality organization and others that are obviously parties to this. So if you imagine us with a massive like hula ring around us and start pushing and see who's going to win. Obviously, I'm a big guy, but all the same, the idea here is that there is, from a security perspective, the mantra would be early involvement as possible. There are some architectural features that can help you do that to be successful. In essence, to make the application context as thin as possible. So in other words, if every application is monolithic, which it's inevitable sometimes because we do acquire companies also, right? So when you acquire something, make them totally monolithic and say, this is our whole environment. But let's ignore that for now. So we say, for us to be able to satisfy security, what we would try to convince architects and product managers to do is to say, use a common application platform that satisfies security. Things like login, authentication, monitoring. Why does every application have to build this anew? Well, they don't need to. So if we have this given, then the application-specific layer would actually be only what the application needs. Now, obviously, to some degree, this is easier said than done, but we have succeeded to at least have some common features and common approach to things. So that's the first thing. The second thing is this ongoing discussion about do not see security as an audit feature. See it more as to some degree, oversight, but to some other degree, a standards stating organization, which means you can tell the developers what you expect them to have, what features, and to some degree being able to automate that. Now, I'm going to oversimplify this, but this is just examples. So the things like we don't want embedded credentials in code. I mean, we do want sensitive data to be encrypted, and you need to be more explicit. What do you mean by encrypted? So if these things are stated, understood, and recognized, that makes our work a little easier. But to your point, we do face every day a shift of culture from let's write code, satisfy a customer, push it to a more organized, more automated method, and the move from one to another is actually quite tricky. The other thing is that we're dealing with some software issues which we cannot ignore. As you hire individuals and you become bigger in scope, you find two things going on. Before, you could have been a generalist. So in security, the early days of my organization, we used to do it all. We do application reviews, vendor onboarding, monitoring, handling incidents, all of the above. Now, as you bring people and you hire somebody, say, this person is going to be in charge of incident management, this other person is going to be in charge of the certifications, then the culture should be of, first of all, determining the roles clearly. Who does what? Ownership and accountability are very important, especially when you grow. And then the other thing is recognize in a culture, especially if you have long tenure, I didn't want to say old timer, to determine that your role is going to change over time. It doesn't mean that because you do less, you are less important. But from a cultural perspective, you need to now be more concerned about how you work with others rather than how much work you personally do. And that's the key cultural shift that I see as we grow as an organization these days.
And, you fulfilled different roles in, various amazing companies, aside from Netscape we discussed, you were part of VeriSign, UNICEF, just to name a few, FAO, you part of Amazon, HBO, Weight Watchers, now Alphabet. But it's how did you manage to, get yourself, familiar with, because every time you go in, I guess there's a learning curve, right? So you have to figure out what kind of the business does and, what does that, and you've done this successfully because I look at your tenure.
Well,
what's your how does your the first 3 months look like for you to get yourself established and be able to figure out what are the kind of the crown jewels in that business and what the business owners really do require? Because that's not an easy task as well for some of these larger organizations.
So I found that when somebody hires a CISO, there is some sort of motivation. At least I can only talk about myself. So when I went to HBO, those were the days after the Sony hack. So a lot of organizations realized that, well, could this happen to us? Other motivations, like in the case of the UN, was some sort of audit that was not that good, and they just needed to bring someone to help improve that. Like when I used to work with Bearing Point, and Bearing Point sent me to the UN to do a security audit, and then I realized that I loved the organization's mission. This was the one organization that I have to say at times very frustrating from the red tape and complexity, but at the same time, it was like totally unambiguous. What are you doing? What do you go to work for? Now, you wouldn't realize that if you are in New York at the headquarters, but you would certainly realize it when you are in a refugee camp in Africa or in other places where you see what do you work for, and things that you take for granted, like setting up a little, we used to call them VSATs, like a little satellite disk to facilitate communication from a Land Rover. It's like challenging from one hand, but from another, it's like totally fulfilling to you as a professional. Now, going back to your question, though, more specifically, the first 90 days, you have to create a plan of what are you trying to achieve. So when I land, I understand the motivation, I understand what's going on, get an assessment from either people that are there or auditors or such, or I pull an assessment of my own. But the first 90 days are important to establish the key issues that you're facing as a security person and the program for the next year or so. The other thing is that you need to create key contacts to understand what do you have to lose? So when I went to HBO, I understood that the movie business is not something that you do from within. You rely very much on third parties to actually deliver for you. And you're most of the times at the tail end, even if you're part of the production. So that tells you what exactly are your threat vectors, who has responsibility for what you can influence and what not. Now, there are similarities to what I do today because you cannot be in the medical devices business by yourself. So we rely on partners, on joint ventures to manufacture devices, bring the sensors, provide the firmware, and build an application that eventually we make available to the consumer. So every single business is like that. The UN does not deliver projects on its own. The UN is in essence a fund. That's the parallel I used to draw in my head, which provides financial support for projects that are part of its program. So that is what I understood. And then by building the right contacts, you go to a different level. One more thing I want to mention is that one of the big important parts of security is to realize that you cannot make policy on your own. That would be very dictatorial and quite risk-prone. So what I mean with that is that one of the things that I'm a big supporter of is to establish a security group. There can be grandiose names for that, a committee.
Yeah, almost like an alliance, an internal alliance, yes. Right? Right.
But the interesting thing about this is that I recall we did an exercise back at UNICEF, which we said security people think that the 5 most important things prioritized would be dealing with incidents, dealing with vulnerabilities, maintaining the confidentiality of our data, and others, all right? But if you go to your marketing person, or you go to your operations person or your finance person, you realize that their 5 most important things from a security perspective are totally different. So the problem for you, therefore, is how do you combine your perceived needs to what the organization is telling you you need. And to actually draw a balance across all of those, because you can actually say, given unlimited capacity and unlimited funds, we can do it all, but that's rarely the case. So we did do an exercise of across the board prioritization of projects, features, and security endeavors. And it was very eye-opening to see that even on the executive suite, we could not get agreement on what was our top priority. Like, lawyers would argue that document management and confidentiality would be the most important thing, while marketing people will say opening, transparency, website, collaboration would be the most important thing to them. And you just need to figure it out as a security person, see how you're going to satisfy it. So that was another thing that, again, talk about culture, but talking about also your first few months to say, I need input from my business partners and counterparts for me to be able to be successful. And that's how it works. And it's not easy because you cannot get them to agree. By definition, their perspectives are different.
And how do you establish that trust? It's, as you mentioned, it takes a village, right? So you need to get that support from all your business counterparts and so on. But I suspect that the UNICEF is very different than Weight Watchers or HBO from a cultural perspective.
Yeah.
So how did you how were you able to gain that trust in very different environments from a organizational cultural perspective? What was your kind of view?
So there are two things. One is you have to deliver. So people will figure you out very quickly if you say, I'll do something for you, and then don't do it. So you have to be able to see yourself as a consultant, as a person who delivers to a client. That doesn't mean that you will do whatever on earth they want. I mean, you still have responsibility, and it is the buck will stop with the security guy for security matters. But you have to be credible. When you say something will happen, something will happen. So the second thing is to realize that, and the way I did that is by making a point to always publish and keep on maintaining every 6 months a roadmap to be transparent about the work that you do. You say, this is what we do, and make a point to reflect what you heard from them. So therefore, by even the old trick, you're in an interview, repeat what the interviewer said, because that implies that you heard them. Well, we play to this trick, but it's not just a trick. It's actually a method to say, I reflect what the organization is telling me the organization needs, wants. And when my counterparts or my management looks at what I have signed up to do, they recognize that these are things that they ask for. But at the end of the day, trust comes with your ability to meet the goals and expectations of the organization. We don't get a lot of excuses, even in major incidents. And at HBO, we did have a major incident that we faced, which actually lasts about 4 months of our lives. And maybe someday, when I convince the lawyers of those days, we may write a book about it. But that was the time where you really recognize the different parts and how things work together, and trust will pay amazing dividends, because you see that to this day, I say, thank you for letting me do my job, because they recognize that you can do it. If you recognize that you need to deal with the incident while, say, legal deals with communications and external interfaces and the 3-letter agencies, and management deals with bringing you lunch and dinner, and so on. So that's where trust pays dividends, but you have to build it.
It's amazing that listening to you, so you have the technical acumen, right? So you're a lifelong learner. I've seen the certification and so on. If you continue to do this, but you also manage to navigate the human element associated with working at a senior level as a cybersecurity professional. and you've done that well, despite the fact that, again, there's no school for that. This is something that you had to learn on the job. It's on the job training. So you managed to do that as well, and you still give back in all kinds of ways. So you sit on the boards of several universities. You're also an EMT, right? So you volunteer for as an EMT as well. So what's your secret for that, like, passion to learn and continue learning and giving back? Where you're obviously super busy doing multiple things at once. What drives you today?
My wife would say it's my ADHD, but I have no big so okay. The EMT thing is very important to me. I was a firefighter for a while, and I enjoyed it immensely. But I have to say that out of the 20 calls the firefighter gets, 10 are missed alarms and so on. Very necessary to show up and so on, and prevention and all. However, an EMT always is called because something is going on. And to be able to help someone is, at the time where you see them at their worst, is very, very fulfilling to me. So that's what prompted me to be doing this, and I enjoy every moment of it. Now, let's throw the parallels to work. As you grow in an organization, I like to continue maintaining a high level of technical acumen because that brings credibility. Obviously, you cannot be as good as the person who does this full time. I cannot compete at any level with even the most junior developer because I don't develop full time, but I know enough to be able to anticipate their problems or to be able to have a conversation of how to improve a product using security features. But when it comes to how to be, I found that an organization has to allow people to be vulnerable professionals. So what does that mean is that they should feel that they can fail. And the only thing I would ask, and that is not me, is the culture of our organization currently, but others as well that I have been associated with years, is to be able to say, learn from your mistake, don't repeat it, but make a point to actually learn and be able to articulate what you learned. And then the other thing is that you have to realize that, I think Kermit the Frog said it in one of the movies, people are people. And you have to be compassionate to people's situation and aware of what is going on. I'm not suggesting be nosy in everybody's lives, but to recognize that by design, someone will need time because there's something going on in their life, and you have to recognize that, or somebody will not being able to deliver because something happened. Now, what I'm asking from and what I offer to my management is that there will be no surprises. We hate surprises in security. So, which means let us know so that we can fix the problem before it becomes a matter of panic or a matter of, especially in our business, sometimes ends up in penalties or other contingencies. So we have to anticipate. But as an organization, we try to be innovative, and we find that we are more innovative when people feel comfortable to take risks, and we expect them to be truthful and transparent. And in return, we will be compassionate to what happens to the human situation. So that's how I think, and I hope it made sense.
Yeah, it does. And do you find that working as an EMT, for example, Stephen, as because you have to come in and see people at the worst time and be able to react quickly and be cool, calm, and collected about it. Does that help in the kind of the cybersecurity realm when something happens that you're like, say, hold on for a second, let me focus on the matter at hand,
yes,
and bring it down to manageable level? I mean, there's some similarities there, right?
I think so. And the similarity is that when you show up and somebody feels really bad or had an accident or you can bring the best tools clicking, beeping, this and plug them in. But I have found that talking to them in a reassuring voice, sometimes holding their hand if that is necessary, just engaging can be so much better. Because look, at the end of the day, even in the most remote places, you're gonna pick up somebody, pack them up, put them into a car, and take them to a hospital. So we're talking your interaction with them, at least in my experience, mostly will be 45 minutes, mostly. And then the more qualified, the doctors take over. Most of the times there will be like a 20-minute thing. So in those 20 minutes, if you can even reassure them and bring them down, relax them, that would be so much better than say, okay, obviously you have to do your job, but there's so much you can do. So what I found is connecting with people on a human level, communicating your expectations, understanding what the common goals are in our day-to-day work, and being able to have them trust that what you're saying you'll do, you will, is actually not only parallel, but is actually essential. So that's how I draw the experience from one to the other.
Well, once people come back to the office, if at all, I don't know if you're probably totally remote, but it'd be great to have somebody like yourself at hand at all times. It's probably super useful. You make people feel safe, both on the, the physical world as well as the virtual world. So let me ask you this, just because we were running out of time, but I'd love to cover a little bit more. So you've seen this industry evolve, right? So now cybersecurity is a board level discussion. Companies are, throwing millions of dollars in defense mechanism to protect themselves. But yet, we're inundated with ongoing disclosures of breaches, data leakage, and so on an ongoing basis. And then we also get like some, almost like these bombs of incidents, like the Log4j, Log4s, the SolarWind. Why haven't we, at least on the surface, we haven't really progressed so much in the past 25 years or 20 years since the days of the manual and the floppy disk. We're still facing pretty sinister issues in our industry.
So first of all, to draw the parallel, our complexity has grown immensely. So we're much more complex than we were back then. And we say we grew, but the industry has grown and the products have grown. But I want to think about something now. I believe that back in the 40s and 50s, baseball players used to hit much more often and much further. Now, I don't know why, but when I look at the averages of, say, the big names of the day, and I'm saying today with the technology and the doctors and the massage and all of that, and we still cannot reach that pinnacle that, you say, Babe Ruth could do. So that's, I'm just trying to draw a parallel. So I'm saying we have tremendous capabilities, but what we see is that the complex technology is now available to everyone. And as such, we have not reached the level of awareness that will help us truly meet what the capability of the technology has made available. We're still dealing with awareness on what we take for granted, and it's things so simple. Don't click on the link unless you know the link is trustworthy. Now, how do you know? Well, there are some tricks that you can tell, or just ask. People keep on doing that, and that results in ransomware attacks and others. So we do therefore see more complex applications, more complex interfaces, proliferation of devices, full automation of our home, of what we wear, everything that we do. And we're just trying to say, this is now available to the most amateur user of these technologies. and the user is totally capable to do all kinds of things, even from a simple, phone. So what we do with that is that we see some aspects of security being commoditized. Firewall management, to some degree vulnerability identification. And we hope that we'll be able to elevate our work into more dealing with incidents and dealing with the effects of that. Now, what we see and what I believe that will help us is by securing the data in a more controlled manner. In practical terms, that means that maybe we will not develop on our laptops anymore. We will develop on a central server that controls the code, and we access that. Now, developers will probably hate that suggestion, but you ask me, how do we deal with that? We will probably make our endpoints thinner, much more straightforward, capable to access something with a strong network and local memory capability, but with very little data, because they do not need the data. That will make our data more safe, controlled, contained, if you like, and not necessarily easily distributable by means of our endpoints. So these are the things that will get us into a point where we can not only recognize the capabilities of the strong technology, but also say that we can control where this information is. I believe blockchain.
No, just to clarify. So you're talking about almost like a client server architecture or a presentation server where the device itself is going to be almost like a brainless device where most of the data is going to be stored somewhere centrally. And I think that the infrastructure is already there, like with 5G and high-speed networks and so on. But with that said, people now buy these endpoint devices like these cell phones, smartphones with like octa cores and 60. I mean, they become more and more, heavy, computing power capable. Despite the fact that we have such high speed. And I know that Google itself is, the intentions are to provide everything in the cloud, including the computing power. There's like even gaming application where all the gaming processing is done at the not at the edge, but at the server side. So is that what we're leaning towards?
Yeah, from a perspective of, obviously, there are some issues about being able to work offline, be able to have access to information offline, but that doesn't mean that once the data connects again, the data doesn't need to be on your endpoint. But we certainly feel that the endpoints need to be much more well managed from a perspective of what kind of information they contain and what kind of information. I think to some degree, I hate to use the buzzword zero trust because it can mean a lot of things to a lot of people. But I like these days to use the notion of not only zero trust endpoint, but zero trust network. Because, look, I mean, I'm using my own Wi-Fi here, and I'm connecting to a lot of sensitive applications back at work. And we have a method to not only verify that I am who I claim to be by my identity, but also by my Google managed laptop and also by my vetted network. So this is where we're going. And now to your original point, the proliferation of all these devices and security capabilities will continue to improve. But we also have to look at, we talk about ransomware. We feel that one capability would be to make our data easily replicatable. So we're looking at things like blockchain. We're looking at things on how can I place my information, not the sensitive one, that's a different story, right? But the information that is necessary to function and being able to rebuild it quickly so that the ransomware attack is not effective. It doesn't hurt anything. And it's not just a matter of backup, it's a matter of easy replication and easy recognition of the data is changing pretty much on a real time because we're sending emails, we're receiving emails, we create documents and so on. So there are technologies, though, for us to be able to say what you did is available easily so that if something happens that you have to rebuild it, you can rebuild it easily. So that's where we're going from a perspective of making ransomware a thing of the past. And that's what's going on. The question, therefore, would be to not only say I have to build better awareness, because that has worked and maybe not, but to actually say, I'm going to make essentially, don't rely on a car that has a complex carburetor. I'm going to make that simple. I'm going to build you an injection. You don't need to worry about it. And the simplicity doesn't mean that it's not going to be slower. It's actually going to be much more powerful, but I'm just going to push the complexity into something that is a little bit more abstract from your interaction with it. I hope that made sense.
Yeah, it does. And, so you mentioned the attack surface has really grown exponentially because of the proliferation of devices and networks and so on. And so did our protection mechanism. And so, but to end in a positive note, this sky is not falling. We're still, despite all this morbid news that are coming, we see every day, and even in the popular mainstream media, which is amazing now to me because that was never the case. We're still making huge progress in all the different areas, whether it's multi-factor authentication in general, network security, as you mentioned, zero trust applications, and so on. And behavioral analysis. There's all kinds of different, quite an amazing advancement in all the space. And maybe we should end in that kind of positive notes that the sky is not falling.
The sky is not falling. We are learning. We're improving. The things that we said, even data retention is not just a matter of days. It's a multidimensional thing now. We'll be able to say this data in this particular context is not good, and it will be removed by itself as a part of attributes that it contains. Biometrics, the things that we work on, the ability to actually deliver medication where medication is supposed to be delivered. The future is amazing, and I'm so hopeful and hope to be able to have my faculties to continue working and be part of what's coming. So I'm very excited about what's going on. And look, if we didn't have the occasional attack or the occasional issue, we wouldn't be improving. Obviously, I hope it won't be on my network, but all the same, we're learning, and we see a lot of startups and a lot of even mature companies that are evolving what we see, and we're trying very hard to keep in touch with them. So all is well, and very hopeful for the future and for what's coming.
Steven, coming from you, somebody like your past and history, an amazing background, you're saying that the future is amazing. That carries a lot of weight and is very enlightening to me. So I really appreciate that. And so last but not least, what's the easiest way for people to reach out to you for anything ranging from advice to insights to additional conversation and whatnot? What's the easiest way?
Email. My email is simple, Fridakis@google.com. And I'm available to talk to anyone for all kinds of subjects. Please be gentle with my response time. But and David, I have to say, I very much appreciate the opportunity and what you do. Dialogue and awareness helps. I don't expect everybody to agree with me, and I don't agree with everything I hear, but at least I become better by exposure and by opportunity to debate and talk and learn. So I very much thank you for the opportunity to be part of your program.
Yeah, thank you very much for the time. Thanks very much for taking the time to chat with us today. Looking forward to having this conversation maybe sometimes in New York in person when things open up and you travel. Until then, everybody, thank you very much for joining today. I'll see you at the next event. And in the meantime, stay safe all and be well.
Thank you.